Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Skift LinkedIn Live on regenerative tourism. I'm happy to be joined by my colleague, Chase-Lubitz, who's our travel and experiences reporter, who's also a climate specialist. Jessie, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Robin. I'm excited to chat about this.
And for those of you who don't recognize me, which is probably most of you, I'm an analyst on the Gilbert-Jones, an analyst on the Skift Research team, specializing also in experiences, but with a background in sustainability. So this is a subject that we both have a great deal of interest in. So this is obviously, or maybe not obviously to everybody, but it's a subject that's has a lot of passionate debate around it, and it's not always that well defined. So what are we actually discussing today? So first off, what is regenerative tourism? And I suppose, what is it not, which is an equally contentious topic. Some of the challenges in measurement and management, that is, in terms of actually scaling it as a paradigm, as a methodology, if it can be that. Some innovative examples, and then looking at using some of our Skift data to look at the consumer perspective. You know, what is the market appetite? Is this something that speaks to the consumer? So what is regenerative tourism? So I should say from the outset that this is by no means a broadly accepted definition. I would argue that there isn't one, in fact. This is one of the more common framings that you will find if you look up regenerative tourism. But if you do try and put it in a box, you do tend to get a bit of pushback, both from advocates of regenerative tourism and from skeptics of it. But with that caveat in mind, one of the more common framings is that whereas sustainable tourism it might be more, if you're sustaining something, you're just sort of mitigating its negative impact, you're managing it. Whereas regenerative tourism is more about leveraging tourism to maximize positive impact. You're actually really embedding tourism as a force for good in a very holistic way across the environment and communities and society broadly. So yeah, that's the general gist of it.
Yeah, what I found really interesting about your report, Robin, is when you talk about the term of regenerative tourism versus the practice. This is an issue in a lot of different elements of climate change, whether we're talking about green cities or renewable energy or offsets or, of course, tourism. I think there's an inclination for companies to use these hopeful terms to give a sense of kind of goodness or good intentions, but what's the real practice behind them? In my reporting, something I've noticed from DMOs or destination marketing organizations is that they use the term stewardship recently. And it's supposed to kind of give a sense of tourists helping to protect the destination, helping them meet the needs of the communities that they're visiting. But it doesn't have a real kind of defined identity. We don't really know what stewardship means. And I personally think it also kind of holds the connotation of ownership and guardianship and that type of thing, rather than looking at, what are the impacts of the tourists visiting these places. But then another example, on the other hand, is that in some places, policies are really stepping in to regulate terminology. So in the EU, a new directive came out in May under the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive to make the word sustainability a legal term. And that means that big companies, basically any company with over 1,000 employees and a turnover of over 450 million euros per year, they have to do thorough due diligence on their supply chain in order to use the term sustainability. So this is a huge amount of corporate accountability and transparency, and it's legally binding. In your work in regenerative tourism, do we have that yet? Do we have a framework? Do we have a terminology that necessarily translates into practice?
So emphatically no. And again, this speaks to something I said around definition earlier. regenerative tourism is something that somewhat defies definition. It doesn't like to be put into a box. And this is somewhat to its credit in some ways, because where it's being applied, it tends to be super site specific. And it's not incompatible with sustainability. So sustainable tourism is something that's been a lot more codified over the years. And when I mentioned that people resist defining regenerative tourism, it's not just the advocates of regenerative tourism, it's also the skeptics. So in defining it in contrast to sustainable tourism, some of the guys who've been involved in sustainable tourism for a lot longer go, well, hang on, we were always about maximizing positive impact. And this new term is kind of maybe throwing sustainable tourism under the bus a little bit. And then from the advocacy side, there's a mindset of, well, it's not about codifying, it's not about metrics and everything like that. But if you look at kind of impact methodologies in the sustainability space, there are things that can be done. And one of the positive things I would say about regenerative tourism is a very holistic approach. It considers, travelers not just as kind of spectators, they're stakeholders in the process. It brings in, cultural heritage factors and indigenous wisdom. And if you look at this, this does map quite well onto some impact methodologies. So in the research we did with the assistance of some experts, suggest some possible ways of actually quantifying this. And if it's not quantifiable, it's not scalable and it's not generalizable. So people have pursued their own methodologies in this area, you can kind of modularize these. So if you look at kind of the environment perspective, there's the visitor perspective, there's a big behavior change element, so kind of bringing the traveler into the fold. These are our metrics, not anymore. These are the ones that I came up with, from a broad range of research. It's just suggestions, but this is a hypothetical. This doesn't currently exist at a scalable perspective. Obviously, you need to take account of the social metrics. There's a huge community and cultural heritage element to how regenerative tourism is being promulgated in a lot of cases. Obviously, the economic factor, it's got to be scalable. Commitment and compliance, this is what you sign up for, what you actually committing yourself to and holding yourself to account for. And there's kind of an innovation and kind of technological component to it as well, designing for the environment, designing for society, and of course the community health and environmental health and all of that. So there's just some hypotheticals around how we could approach this. There are some organizations that are getting close to this. So EarthCheck have done a lot of really innovative work around sustainable tourism, kind of creeping into the regenerative tourism side. They've done quite a bit of they don't have a regenerative tourism methodology per se, but they're sort of bumping up against that and have done a lot of work around regenerative tourism. The Global Sustainable Tourism Council, Weaver is an interesting one. They're actually a company here in South Africa. They, for a smaller company, have developed an incredibly innovative approach to impact measurement and management around regenerative tourism. And very sadly, only a few days ago, we found out that the business is closing down. So, that speaks to some of the struggles in the market of trying to establish this.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a really difficult thing to do. It seems, though, like there might be kind of a higher level methodological structure that could be applied without having to be so specific to each case. And that kind of exists in the climate world. We see that the IPCC has a comprehensive guideline for national greenhouse gas inventories. We have environmental impact assessment reports, which are all going to be different depending on what project you're looking at. But in general, there's a legal framework for deciding if a new project needs to be assessed for its impact on its environment. Is there something we could do? Is there an approach we could take where you're kind of applying a really high level methodological structure, and then each individual case can tailor that for its individual needs.
So potentially, yes. And again, I'm drawing on the, there's a lot of work that's been done in the financial sector, in the impact and ESG space, around this concept of materiality. This hasn't, as far as I know, really been applied that rigorously to the travel sector at large. If you look at major, hotel groups and things like that, in their annual sustainability reports, they'll have a materiality section, but it hasn't really penetrated the tourism and travel sector that much. But it is something that could potentially apply to regenerative tourism, because if what you're doing is really site specific and you can't have a one size fits all approach to all different destinations, tourism sites, businesses, if you can't standardize the metrics, you could potentially standardize the methodology for determining the metrics. And that is, in broad strokes, what materiality is about. So a material issue is an economic, environmental, or social, I would probably add a few to those, issue on which the company both has an impact or may be impacted by. So in a materiality assessment, you would kind of map things onto, and they are called materiality maps, you would map things onto this and kind of three-dimensional space and determine, okay, what are the most versus least important metrics for us to track based on what the most material issues are in this particular case. So this is just a very, very broad framing of that, and it's maybe somewhere that it could go in future. So as I mentioned, there is some good work being done. It's very bottom up, and that's possibly a good thing. It's not very top down, but there are some really great case studies. One of the things we talked about earlier, Jesse, you mentioned, term versus practice. And one of the criticisms of regenerative tourism, but I would argue also a business case for it, is that it's been practiced before it became a term. So one example, for example, is the Eden project in the UK. It was an abandoned clay pit, a very degenerated area. It's now become this world-renowned botanical garden and education center. So it's not just this environmental component. They haven't just planted some trees in a single area. It's become a big movement. It's gone global. I used to live in this area, as a matter of fact, and it's had a huge impact on the community. So one could argue this is regenerative tourism before regenerative tourism became a thing, and it's also very profitable. They track a lot of metrics, and there are now projects opening up in China and elsewhere. New Zealand has been very big on regenerative tourism, and particularly if we look at Bay of Plenty, again we see this modular approach to rolling out regenerative tourism. So they have the 6 C's model: so continuity, congruence, consistency, communication, collaboration, and co-creation. And again, they have their own definition of regenerative tourism. It is very sort of site-defined, but I do quite like this. It makes the point that humans shouldn't be separated from nature. When humans are absent from an area for long enough, they lose the practical knowledge needed to interact with the environment, and soon after that has a negative impact on nature. Regenerative tourism is it's a process of partnership with nature in resonance with indigenous wisdom. So that's where the indigenous aspect comes in. As a data guy, this can sound a little bit sort of pie in the sky, but if you're taking a rigorous approach to it, it can have great effects. Queensland, again, they don't necessarily define this as regenerative tourism, but when considering an ecotourism project, they have this matrix where they determine whether a project is suitable for the landscape values and the compared to the nature and scale of the operation. So, is this just a business deal, or does this actually fit into the nature of the area, and is this appropriate? So again, we've seen that kind of holistic approach.
Yeah, I think it's also kind of important to look at this on the grander scale of the fact that we, care about this, that we're talking about this, that companies care about this. It's showing that there's clearly a demand from consumers for companies to focus on how we're impacting the lands that we visit, how sustainable their policies are. And in my reporting, I've seen that from a lot of companies. You see, TUI issued sustainability-linked bonds. Plenty of airlines are talking about how to be more carbon neutral. I took a flight on Delta a few months ago, and they'd integrated non-plastic cutlery into their meals. Small things like that. And maybe that's not making the biggest kind of dent in carbon emissions, but it also shows that clearly companies are responding to consumer demand and saying like, hey, look, we're trying. It seems like that's happening also with regenerative tourism becoming more popular. When you're looking at your kind of consumer demand picture, what did you see in your research?
Yeah, so that's a really critical point, in that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of the term behavior change. I know I'm the one using it in this context, but there's an element with regenerative tourism in comparison to previous takes on sustainable tourism, ecotourism, whatever. It's less about sort of managing and controlling the impact of the traveler, the tourist, and more about kind of bringing them into the fold, and actually including them. And the question then is, well, is that something that consumers necessarily want? So the first thing to say is that in terms of the actual term, consumers are not super familiar with the term regenerative tourism. We can see among some of the younger generations, they've heard of it. Some of them are very familiar with it, but it hasn't penetrated that far into the consumer mindset. But the corollary question then is, yes, but the values that regenerative tourism represents, is there an appetite for that? Well, our data suggests yes. We've done quite a bit of research into the values of travelers in the current context, in the post-COVID context. And I mean, this data, for example, compared to pre-COVID-19, do you expect your preferences in the following areas to change? Is supporting destinations that practice green tourism going to be more or less important than before COVID-19? And yeah, we're seeing, overwhelmingly, people are thinking more about these things. They want to be engaged about these topics. And this goes back to some of the points I made earlier about measurement and management. There are some caveats to that, which Jessie, I believe you're going to speak to.
Yeah, and this does kind of go back to the sort of term versus practice mentality of, consumers, they really care about companies doing this, but they also care if these are credible claims, right? So in the last year, at least, maybe 6 months or so, we've seen a lot more greenwashing cases pop up in the travel industry. We're seeing some examples of this where Lufthansa, a climate ad in the UK was banned. Ryanair, Delta, and EasyJet are among 71 airlines that were warned over greenwashing. A Dutch court ruled KLM was greenwashing, Booking.com campaign as well. And so if destinations and businesses are catering to this appetite for sustainability, it's going to be critical, it seems, to be able to really follow through on these promises. Do you think that there's some customers that are caring about these cases more than others? Do you think there's going to be follow-up from the kind of consumer perspective on this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if we look at that same, there is some suspicion of companies when it comes to sustainable claims, sustainable practices. This chart shows the proportions that think they're mostly just greenwashing, and we can see there's quite a bit more scrutiny being applied by the younger generations. They're perhaps sort of grown up in the sort of the green and sustainable claims era and the ESG era, and they're a little bit more wise to unsubstantiated claims being made. That being said, when we do look, and this is specifically data around this is millennials and Gen Z, they do resonate a lot with the values that regenerative tourism is promulgating. So if these are the main societal concerns that millennials and Gen Z have about societal issues in relation to the travel industry, and the top two are the potential impacts of tourism on local communities and cultural preservation. That cultural preservation piece is key there, and climate change and environmental sustainability in the context of the traveler. And of course, these are things that are not absent from sustainable tourism. Again, we need to be careful about throwing sustainable tourism under the bus, but regenerative tourism does particularly emphasize a holistic approach to both society and environment, and has that element of cultural preservation and community engagement. Again, among the Gen Z and millennial adventure travel market, you see here their main motivation for participating in adventure tourism is desire to connect with nature, and that word "connect" is key here, because that's something that regenerative tourism really emphasizes. It's not just about managing the negative impacts of tourists as they trample over your destination. It's also facilitating a level of connection between the traveler and the natural and cultural environment, which is something that very, very much emphasized by regenerative tourism. And of course, sustainable tourism in its various forms often comes with a premium. So the question is whether people are willing to pay for it. And again, this is among millennials and Gen Z. We can see that quite a large proportion are willing to pay $30 to $100, or in some cases more than $100 for more sustainable options. So it indicates a willingness to actually put their money where their mouth is in terms of their values, and those that are sort of not really paying anything are actually in a minority there. Obviously, with the caveat that this is voluntarily submitted data, it doesn't necessarily translate into action, but it's still meaningful in terms of their values. So another thing to note, so we mentioned the generational picture there. There's sometimes a bit of a myth that sustainable tourism and caring about sustainability and being willing to really engage with sustainability is this kind of luxury of the wealthy West, and is less of a concern among developing nations. Well, if we look at the really critical growing outbound markets of India and China, if we ask them if it's important to them to choose responsible travel businesses, India and China, are very, very much in agreement. So it does somewhat put light to this idea that it's not a universal concern on a national level. And in fact, again, we can see that, particularly in India, but also more so in China than in Australia, UK, and US, they're willing to make more sustainable, eco-friendly decisions regardless of whether it causes inconvenience to them or not just that if it's an easy option. So again, that thing around bringing the traveler into the fold, giving them agency, this idea of personal action, contributing, this is perhaps more universal than we've given it credit for. Yeah, sorry, you wanted to jump in there, Jessie.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to kind of comment. I think this is such an insightful element from your report, because I don't think that that's the assumption for most people. I think it's often seen as like making eco-conscious decisions is more expensive and therefore only for the luxury, the people who can afford it. And in travel, that's luxury, but it could also be products. You know, I can't afford to buy nice used clothing. It's cheaper to go to fast fashion and stuff like that, which is largely true. But to see this kind of data just right in front of you, really obvious, it shows that we can start to question those assumptions that this isn't, you know, just a value that is for the people who can afford it. So I think that's a great takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and yeah. So it's something that resonates. But to sort of go back to what we were talking about earlier, I mean, if this can scale, you know, there's nothing ostensibly negative about regenerative tourism. It's been the subject of some controversy. There's a bit of buzzword fatigue, but the idea of leveraging tourism to maximize positive impact across these holistic measures of society, of nature, to reconnect us with nature, this is all to the good. But it's and this kind of loops us back to the beginning. Just to remind everyone attending, if you have some questions, you can pop them into the chat and we'll answer at the end. But yeah, you have to be able to actually demonstrate your impact, and it's so important given the history of, as you mentioned, Jessie, the history of greenwashing within travel. You don't want to make unsubstantiated claims, and you know, I'm gonna quote Weaver here of blessed memory. Data is important because it tells a real, verifiable, true story. Analyzing that story and learning from it leads to progress that benefits everybody. Might sound trite, but you know, it's just this is the what I always like to end on this topic, because it's really critical just to be able to back up what you're saying, because we can all talk about green labels and they, you know, there isn't necessarily a one organization or one set of standards or one piece of legislation that is currently regulating this or able to say, you know, we've got the right approach. So I've you know, added a few companies here that and organizations that are coming close, but it's on businesses to come together and actually figure out, you know, how do we do this? How do we do this in a defensible way? And given that there is you know, there is a consumer appetite, how do we do this in a way that resonates with consumers and also you know, addresses their concerns around greenwashing and actually making substantiated claims? So yeah, that's basically it.
It's a difficult thing to figure out, but yeah, really great research on this. So thank you for this conversation. As Robin said, if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat and we can do what we can to answer them. We do have 2 questions here. Let's see. Great. So do you think that regenerative tourism is being used as a greenwashing term today, or is it still an impactful movement?
I think actually among the people who want to engage in greenwashing, I suspect that it has a similar character to at the consumer level. I don't think the hardcore greenwashers have fully cottoned onto it yet, and that's why I'm quite. When I say I'm quite critical of regenerative tourism, I'm actually in some ways trying to protect it because it's early enough in its development that it's quite a niche thing. And it hasn't been rolled out as this sort of commercial label that people can slap on things and say, well, we're regenerative. It probably is starting to get thrown around in a little bit too casual a way in some quarters, but I can't speak to that empirically.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think that something can also be both a little bit. Obviously, we don't want it to be greenwashing, but I think there is something to be said about trying to achieve it, even if it's not quite doing everything we want it to do. And so kind of pushing every rock we can up the mountain, if you will, is still worth it at this point. And I feel like this is just one of those examples. We actually have another question also from Seth about advice that we might have for travel businesses trying to win credibility and business from customers who are greenwashing skeptics. What would be more effective, committing to a science-based CO2 target or a more holistic regenerative approach that includes the cultural and community aspects?
I think you can do both. And thanks, Seth, for prompting me on this, because there's one thing I forgot to mention earlier, which is that, there are these certification organizations, your Earth checks and things like that. No one's expecting consumers to go out and read, a 200-page PDF on impact metrics and things like that. But the optics around voluntarily signing up to some kind of third-party certification does speak to some level of credibility. There might be some greenwashing around labeling and things like that, and that's maybe a more into the weeds topic for another day. But it's a start, and it shows voluntary commitment, and that's why when we looked at those hypothetical impact metrics earlier, we had that one around commitment, like that's what you're willing to sign up for. In terms of the interaction between those two topics, if they're not covered under the same umbrella, then you should be signing up to both, ideally. But I think what you probably shouldn't be signing up to some regenerative label and then not signing up to the climate commitments as well, because what we don't want is for the very nice sort of pleasant optics around regenerative tourism to become a distraction from the hard work of actually addressing and the boring kind of bean counter work of addressing climate change. That does need to be front and center.
Yeah, I agree. I think from my perspective, if I'm looking, having that kind of serious science-based target is gonna give me a little bit more comfort. Obviously, both is better, but they do completely different things. And so, yeah, I think that I would agree with what you said there. Okay, we have another one from Greece. Is there so far a regenerative framework against greenwashing for regenerative criteria, or are there practices a business or destination can adhere to so that they can make substantiated claims?
That would be wonderful. Yeah, there isn't a globally agreed upon framework, and certainly not one that is legislative or legally binding. But that's kind of the call to action, I would say, for businesses is, the regenerative movement, and it does call itself a movement. There's a very big collaborative element to it. So I would say, if there isn't one, then it's for businesses that care about this to come together and establish that. And again, there are those that come close. I mentioned a few labels earlier. B Corp actually has done a lot of good work in this area. And I spoke to someone from Global Sustainable Tourism Council who helped establish it. And he's quite suspicious of eco labeling in general, but he's quite a big advocate of B Corp tourism, and EarthCheck are very good. But again, these are private companies that are offering a service. So yeah, it's still quite a fragmented space.
Yeah, I think this is the case in almost every aspect of climate change right now. We're really struggling to get serious frameworks in place, and most of it is voluntary. And so it's really up to the companies on whether or not they want to adhere to that. But I think it's really burgeoning. Like, you can feel that there's a lot of talk about this, and I feel like we're very much on the cusp of having a lot more of these frameworks be like in policy or run by kind of one overarching organization. So I feel like it's something to look out for in the coming years. Moving on to the next one. So how can corporate travel programs integrate regenerative tourism to deliver both business benefits and positive environmental and social impacts?
Jesse, do you want to take that one to start, and I'll build on it?
Corporate travel programs. I think there's a group element to corporate travel programs potentially, where maybe I think there's a lot of sort of like group building maybe they could be doing, where they're integrating more into regenerative tourism. But I think it's kind of the same as most travelers, where you have to seek it out and find the responsible programs. And I'm not sure if I have a great answer to that one.
Yeah, there aren't many easy answers to this at this stage, but and not to sound like a broken record, but delivering both business benefits and environmental and social impacts. Environmental and social impacts really are around what you're doing. So that's site specific, around what are the issues for where you're operating, in the communities you're operating, in the ecosystem in which you're operating, and then obviously the broader ecosystem. So that's your climate impact and whatnot. And in terms of business benefits, at the end of the day, that's bottom line and that's profitability. So if you're speaking to a consumer demand for regenerative business practices, which I think we've demonstrated that there are, then it comes back to what we've been saying around being able to credibly demonstrate that impact and show consumers that you are what you say you are.
Okay, we've got another one on startups. I'm not sure I have the answer to this, but maybe you know a little bit more. How have startups in the regenerative tourism space done? Is there a large funding market?
Yes. So I'm going to give away one of my sources now, but I spoke to someone from Untours. They fund small businesses in this area. They are, and I'm not hugely knowledgeable about this space, but yeah, there is an investment community around this. It's burgeoning. It's niche. But it is attracting investment. And one of the, in my previous role, I worked in the ESG space, particularly for the financial sector. And whether it's within the travel sector or outside of the travel sector, impact-focused businesses are only going to attract more investment going forward. So not to get too into the weeds with that, but in the sustainability, this is outside travel now, you have this distinction between ESG, environmental social governance, and impact. So ESG is about minimizing harm, minimizing risk, do no harm, and impact is more about creating positive impact. And if you map that onto travel, ESG is again, not to throw sustainable tourism under the bus, but from a certain point of view could be seen as the more sustainable tourism perspective, and regenerative tourism is an impact perspective. It's about creating positive impact. So if the broader financial sector is anything to go by, then impact-focused tourism businesses are going to be extremely attractive for investors going forward.
Okay, so right now we have one more. See if anything else comes in the meantime. Are any, and this you sort of answered a little bit, but are there any companies that stand out and are excelling in regenerative tourism?
I'd say it's more destinations than companies. There are some individual sites that we've looked at. I was very impressed with Playa Viva in Mexico, who they've developed their own set of impact metrics, and this is what I often go back to when I say it's like really site specific. Like one of the metric they set up in an area where there's endangered sea turtles, and one of the metrics they track is like number of sea turtle eggs relocated to sanctuary and things like that. So businesses that really kind of take that very innovative materiality lens to their specific footprint are the ones that I find most impressive. I would sort of rattle off a bunch of them off the top of my head. There are actually a few in South Africa. Grootbos Nature Reserve have done amazing work. And I also want to give a shout out to some of them that don't define themselves as regenerative tourism. So I mentioned earlier the Eden Project. They've been doing this for over 20 years, it's again, the practice hasn't necessarily had as short a lifespan as the term.
Well, great. I think that's it. We have no more questions. So this was great. Thank you so much for bringing all of your insight into this. It was a really great conversation to have.
Great. Thank you, Jesse. And for anyone interested in learning more, you can, the report is up on screen with the QR code. And we would love for you to read more and learn more about our research. And thank you, Jesse. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Great. Thanks.